Welcome to Chan's the Man Apologetics, a podcast for training followers of Christ to see reality through the lens of the biblical worldview. I'm your host, Chan Heron. Topics include Christian doctrine, apologetics, political issues, special guests, and of course, lots of fun. Let's get started. Well, listen, welcome to Chan's the Man Apologetics.
Okay.
I'm so excited to be able to have this conversation with you and really looking forward to our discussion. Let me just say that to our audience here that this is Peter Young. I have been chatting with him the last couple months, or so, planning this.
Weeks, couple months, yeah.
We've been working on trying to get this thing together, and he's going to talk a little bit about himself and his book. And I feel like I know a lot about you after reading that book.
You probably do. You know a lot more about me than I know about you.
Well, Peter, tell my listeners a little bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get into the cult issue later.
Sure. So born and raised in New Jersey to a Christian home, youngest of 5 boys. And I always give people the Reader's Digest version of my life. I played basketball in college at George Washington University, and I was going to be the next Larry Bird, and that didn't happen.
Woo!
So then I got into coaching, and I coached 1 year at college, 1 year at high school, and I was going to be the next John Wooden, and that didn't happen. So then I got into sports broadcasting, and I was going to be the next Bob Costas, and that didn't happen. But I had a nice run as a broadcaster, loved it, traveled all over the world. And then I've written 2 books, and I released my first book in 2016, and then my second one this year. And I'm not trying to be the next John Steinbeck or Louis L'Amour or John Grisham. I'm just trying to be the best me.
Fantastic. Well, you know, you are a really good writer because you had me on the edge of my seat. And
Yeah.
And I was actually yelling at Uncle Robert, even though I never met him. So you and I have a lot in common. Man, I wanted to be the next Larry Bird as well. Played college basketball on NAIA level, and those are some great times. Give us your background as far as how you came to know Christ. A little bit about your testimony.
Sure. Well, my testimony certainly changed over the years, but as a kid, there was really 2 things that were really important to me: basketball and my faith. So in upstate New York, there's a place called Camp of the Woods, and it's a Christian resort. And back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, the guy that ran it was Norm Sonju, who was back then the general manager for the Dallas Mavericks and a very strong believer. So it was at one of those camps, I think I was 13, that I accepted the Lord, surrendered my life to the Lord, or whatever you want to call it. But I knew I was a sinner. I knew I needed the Lord, and I accepted it. And so that would have been, again, early 80s. And but a lot of that changed. I mean, again, that portion of my testimony didn't change at all. And we can get into the cult here in just a bit. But my testimony, my faith was really challenged by this tiny little religious cult that I found myself kind of swallowed up in many years later, my late 40s. And the cult leader, which is typical of cult leaders, they act as a gatekeeper to God, or at least they try to, really made me question my faith and my testimony. I thought there's something I must be missing. Like, I'm a Christian all my life, and there must be something I'm missing because this Uncle Robert has something that I don't, which of course was not true. It was utter nonsense. But I was brainwashed. That was, my late 40s. Now I look back, because in that moment when I accepted the Lord as a teenager, like the thief on the cross, did I know everything? Did I have all the answers? No. Did I, attend a Bible study, read the Bible front to back? No. But I believed. And, after now having kind of come full circle a couple of times, it feels like I realized that, it's like the perfect testimony, because once I was saved, once I truly believed in the Lord, I wasn't perfect, but I started my journey with a perfect Savior because I needed it, because I was very imperfect, and I still am.
Excellent. I couldn't agree more with you on that. That once we realize that we can't do anything to earn God's favor, it's like a burden is just taken off of us. It's like Paul said in Ephesians that, for by grace are we saved through faith. So you've written. I haven't read the Blue Team yet, but that's on my okay.
There you
So
go.
he's got two books, listeners, and the one that he sent me to read is
Yep.
called "Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger." Now, what was intriguing to me about this is the title, and I'm like, what? That seems just like a strange title. And it had to do, and I don't want to spoil it too much for the readers, but it was a dream that Paige had. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Paige, which is not her real life, I changed a few of the first names in the book, but yeah, Paige and I were married back in 1997. We were married for over 20 years, and when we met, right before we met, she had this very important dream, so important that she would reference it many years later in her testimony, how she became a Christian. And her uncle Robert, who was not an uncle, not related, born and raised in Syria, was able to then interpret that dream for Paige. And basically, I believe Paige was given this dream by the Lord as a warning and a way out from a life that was not honoring and was going to, and already was damaging her, was dangerous to her. And she, of course, then had the dream and immediately sent, it to her beloved Uncle Robert because he was the expert on everything at that point in her life. She was early 20s. And he turned it on its head, completely turned the dream and the message 180 degrees from where it should have gone, and thus further cemented his control over Paige. His brainwashing continued, and the misinterpretation of that dream, the misapplication of it, and also for me at the time, because I found out about the dream right after I met Paige, that it is still reverberating to this day, 26 years later, how I think things probably could have been different if one or both of us had recognized what it really meant. And I'll let you, I'll save it for the readers because it is absolutely fascinating. And I didn't know it until 20 some odd years later when the Lord finally opened my eyes and ears to the truth that this little man, Uncle Robert, cemented his control over Paige in that moment. And as far as I know, has never relinquished it.
Wow. When most people hear the word cult, when I saw your profile, as I was wanting to get you to be a guest on my podcast, and I saw that you were a cult survivor, I was curious at first. I'm like, okay, where did he come from? And when I saw you had lived in Idaho, I immediately went to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, better known as Mormons. And usually when we hear the word cult, we may think of something real extreme, like what happened in Jonestown, where the mass suicide, where you have what happened at Waco with David Koresh. And those are more the well-known, extravagant, extremist type cults. How would you define a cult if someone was to ask you about that? What is the definition of a cult?
Well, I believe cults do come in all shapes and sizes, large and small, but at their core, at their foundation, they are undue mind control, coercive, manipulative mind control. They always have a leader, quite often a male, but not always, but they always have a leader. And there are also signs and patterns and features of cult leaders that, are across the board. Number one, they're narcissistic, usually charismatic. They make all the rules, but usually none of the rules apply to him or her. They have a grandiose sense of self, and they act as a gatekeeper to God, whatever religion that they are espousing. And they will attack the nuclear family, so that all loyalty of the members goes to the cult leader. So again, the foundation is the undue, coercive, manipulative mind control. Then from there, it goes out, right? Like, again, in Jonestown, you have the mass suicide, David Koresh, there's Heaven's Gate, Scientology, all kinds of stuff, right? There's also a lot of small cults. And I think what really is so surprising for people, maybe even like you, is to realize that there are a lot of tiny cults, anywhere from like 2 to a dozen or so people in these little cults, which is what we were. We were a very small cult, 12 people at most, probably. And we hid in broad daylight. In other words, I was a sports broadcaster for many of these years when we were in this little cult. And I was traveling around the country calling games. I was doing college football, college basketball, I'm doing skiing, cycling, all kinds of stuff. And nobody had any idea what was going on, because cults tend to try and keep everything very, very secretive, unless they're the large ones that are trying to bring in other converts, but they keep the inner workings of it secret always.
Now, you mentioned that the key is there, the grandiose leader. Does this leader kind of rise to power on his own? Is he charismatic? What is it? How does somebody gain that kind of control over people, either an individual or groups, to where you can't question them?
Mhm.
There's no, even in your book, when you had some questions for Uncle Robert, he would be offended that you would bring these up. So how do they get to that point where they just they just have so much control?
Well, great question. Let me first of all answer that by telling you about my experience, because I may not be the cult expert, but I'm the expert on my experience. And so Uncle Robert, real name is Robert Booty, born and raised in Syria, came to America, married an American woman, and then went to a small seminary in Fresno, California, where he met my future in-laws. And my future in-laws would have been, I think, kind of ripe for the picking. It was kind of a perfect match of personalities that were a little bit odd, let's say, or not very mainstream, but again, ready for a relationship that was very domineering. And Robert Booty was charismatic, narcissistic already. I believe he had to have been back then. And so then that relationship started where it was, almost parasitical, right? Where, Robert would just glom onto these people and control them. And then it grew from there to when my in-laws then had children. And then, one of their daughters, Paige, gets married. So that, to me and our kids. So it grows slowly over time. And I also believe that his control grew over time, his power and authority. At times it was questioned, and then he would always be able to find a way, almost like, a general or a military leader, cornered. Let's picture Custer, and then somehow miraculously finds a way to win the battle. That's happened a number of times with Uncle Robert and his little cult, where you would think, oh, we're going to finally be done with this guy. And it ends up where he's got even more control, which is what happened during that dream, in the late 90s. And so I believe, though, that I'm sure his personality was always, much the same, ready to do this. And then when he found a willing audience, he was off to the races.
Was he a really good speaker?
He was very good in small settings. He actually spoke at our wedding. And the funny thing is, he spoke at our wedding, and then, again, 20 some odd years later, when my family was unraveling along with my marriage, one of my brothers told me that there are a few people that almost walked out of the ceremony. And I don't remember a word of what he said.
Oh, wow.
But yeah, he was very confident. I would not call him a polished speaker that you'd be on the edge of your seat, but he certainly wasn't nervous. He wasn't shy. And he could quote scripture very well, knew the Bible. Again, and he loved audiences, large and small. So I remember there'd be numerous times we would have these conferences in northern Idaho, where that's where my in-laws lived. We were living in Idaho or southern Idaho or Montana. Robert would come up from California. And these conferences, he would just sit and talk for hours and hours and hours. And then we would take a break, maybe go eat lunch or dinner. And if he had something he wanted to say and there was other conversations going on at the table, he was the master of kind of this pregnant pause, and he would look around and then people would kind of stop talking. And he had to have everyone's attention all the time. He could not stand when other conversations were going on at the same time. He had to have everybody's attention. Yeah.
That is interesting. Did this group have a name? Did y'all have a name?
No, there was no name. You could call it the Cult of Uncle Robert, but there's no name. He did have a little organization that he called, which is really just him. I think he called it the Royal American Institute for World Peace, which is really just him. And his Royal American Institute for World Peace, it's fascinating because there was kind of a combination of two of his strongest ideologies. So number one, he called casinos the true churches in America. So the church that
That
you and I
was
would go to
interesting.
chant on Sunday, you're wasting your time, it's worthless. And so he would go to the casinos, the theory being anybody could go into a casino and be blessed by the Lord.
Now, he didn't say, "Hey, y'all, let's go to the casino." What was the code word that he used that you
He
mentioned
called
in
it
the
his
book?
office. He called it the office. So he would be, when they would go to the casino in northern Idaho, when we do our conferences, there was a casino about an hour away. I would always stay at home and watch the kids. We had young kids, and then they would go, my wife and Uncle Robert and my in-laws, and they would go to the office. And I just was flabbergasted that that's how they thought about it. But most of the casinos Robert would go to would be on Indian reservations. Okay, so he then I think must have felt, and I was never too sure about this, that they were the true Israelite tribes that came over to America a long time ago. And then the other portion of his theology, which is a little bit darker, was that all of recorded history is basically a conspiracy by the Jews to take over the world and dominate Christians. For him, that went back to the twins of Jacob and Esau. And Jacob, does steal the birthright from Esau. Esau becomes Edom, which becomes modern Jewry. Jacob becomes modern Christendom. And so Robert felt that, ever since then, Esau, Edom, the Jews have been trying to get the birthright back through recessions, depressions, and bank runs, and psychology, and Freud, and you name it. And whenever I would ask questions like, okay, I'm trying to have an open mind here, where's the proof? The answer was never, okay, I'll give you the proof. It was, why are you so stupid? And
Mm.
why do you question me? Just trust me. Because that's what everyone else in the cult did. You just trusted the leader. You shouldn't question the leader. And I had a hard time with that.
I can imagine so, especially if someone had any kind of Old Testament background about the Jews, and then you look at Jesus of Nazareth, who was Jewish himself. Now, you said that Uncle Robert attended seminary.
Yep. Yep.
What was the name of that seminary?
I don't even know if it's under the same name, but I believe it's a small, I think it's Mennonite, maybe Mennonite Brethren.
Okay.
It was in Fresno. I'm not sure if it's still there. I think it is, and I think it's grown since then. But the interesting thing is, my former father-in-law did not receive his diploma. They refused to graduate him. So he clearly had issues all the way back then. This is late 60s, early 70s. And Robert did graduate, but his seminar, his thesis, whatever you want to call it, or his master's, was on the protocols of the learned elders of Zion. That forgery, that anti-Semitic forgery that came out in the turn of the last century. And his famous line was, if everything that they talk about is coming true, what does it matter if it's a forgery? And they graduated him, but that's been kind of his life's work. And he's very passionate about that.
Did he consider himself to be a Christian? If he was asked about his religion, how would he classify it?
Yeah, so he would say he's a Christian and that he and a very limited amount of people on the face of the earth, maybe just him at this point, I don't know, would only know the true gospel. So yes, he would call himself a Christian, non-denominational, as I would. I would not say I'm a part of a denomination. I'm just a Christian. To me, that's all I need to say, right? I'm a follower of Christ. But that's very typical of cult leaders, is that they're the only ones who know the true gospel. I will add this: cult leaders don't lure you in. They don't gain your trust by just spouting utter nonsense right away. A guy didn't hear casinos or churches, until 5-6 years into our marriage. I didn't hear this about the Jews until 3-4 years into our marriage. And Robert was always around, right? So it was years before I started hearing this stuff. There's other things that he was shared. I'd be like, I agree with that. That's well put. He's done good research. Thank you for sharing that with me. But then slowly but surely he would continue to twist and pervert the word of God until, years later, it's nowhere near what the gospel is really trying to say.
Yeah, I guess one of the things that really fascinated me about your book is how you had been convinced that maybe you didn't really become a Christian at the camp you were talking about.
Yeah.
And apparently, Uncle Robert had gotten in Paige's ear
Mhm.
about you, correct?
Oh yeah, for
And
years. Yeah, they doubted my faith. Yeah.
and what is it that you were trying to? What is it that you felt like you lacked in order to gain salvation?
Hmm. Great question. So let me see if I can answer it a couple ways. So you go back to when I was 13 years old, and in summer camps, you could probably remember, they do what you call it the altar call, or hey, if you pray this prayer with me, you repeat with the follower. And I'd heard it several times, and just one night I decided, yeah, I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ. I'm a sinner, and I prayed silently to myself, and I firmly believed that I was saved. And I didn't jump up and down. I didn't high five anybody. I didn't tell anybody because I was shy, and I wasn't doing it for recognition. I believe I was sincere. So then later that night, one of the coaches, one of the camp counselors, asked me, "Are you a Christian?" I said yes, and I didn't know the guy very well. I was nervous. And he says, "Well, did you accept the Lord tonight?" And I said, "No, I lied," and I instantly was bothered by it. And so, for years that would bug me, and I would ask the Lord into my heart over and over and over again. I thought, come on, this is silly. And again, I look back on it now, and it's like it doesn't bother me a bit. It just shows why I needed to be saved. Because here it is, I've been saved, and I'm still lying. And,
Hmm.
and and if I was perfect, I wouldn't need a savior. I wasn't perfect. So it bugged me for years and years. But again, I didn't really think I wasn't a Christian. But then Robert was able to convince Paige she wasn't through that dream. And then Paige didn't think I was. I somehow convinced her I was. But she, for years, was kind of, on the fence whether or not she thought I was a believer. So then, 16, 17 years into our marriage, I'm so exhausted trying to, on the one hand, defend my faith, and on the other hand, save my marriage and have a wonderful, loving marriage to a woman, though, that continually doubts my faith, not openly, but I know she does. And then she's, drawing more and more closer to this guru, this cult leader, who also doubts my faith, also questions everything that comes out of my mouth. And we at one of our conferences, everybody was asked to share their testimony. And so I shared a testimony that really wasn't mine. I thought this is what they wanted to hear, and it would make them be quiet. Well, it had the exact opposite effect. And so I finally just gave up. Is probably the best way to put it, Chan. I just caved. I gave up. I was exhausted, tired of trying to fight them. But then, like that day, I'm like, really? I'm in my late 40s and I wasn't a Christian until now. What was I missing? Like, what's new? What's different? And I didn't have an answer. Of course, now the answer is there's nothing new. I didn't need that. It was fraudulent, and it was wicked of them to do that to me.
So that's definitely one of the techniques you seem to be talking about. Because you said that in your book that it wore you down to the point where it was you were mentally exhausted, and you just didn't like, okay, fine, whatever. You were trying to be a peacemaker there. It sounded to me like when I was reading the book, I'm like, this Uncle Robert seems to think he's the Holy Spirit because
Well,
he.
again, yeah, the way I would put it is I like the phrase gatekeeper. So you know your Bible that
Mhm.
Jesus is the gate, right? Anybody that that goes over the fence is a goat, right? The sheep hear his voice and the sheep respond. So then Robert would have set himself up as a gate prior to Jesus. In other words, you had to get
Mm.
his approval first before you're ready for Jesus. The other way I kind of put it is he would kind of switch the order of sanctification and salvation. You're saved, salvation, and then sanctification, you grow in your faith. You can't reverse the order. And someone who tells you that is just basically, again, trying to act as a gatekeeper. You got to do these certain things so you can earn your salvation, i.e., so you can earn my approval, and now you're ready for Jesus. And
That sounds
that's what he would do.
that sounds like trying to clean your fish before you catch them. You know,
Or
that,
catch your chickens before you hatch, whatever phrase you want
yeah,
to put, but it is unbiblical,
absolutely,
and it is wicked.
absolutely. Um, can you share some of the stories that you wrote in your book? Like, I don't know if anybody would ever, and you can choose what you want to talk about, but I don't know if anybody would ever be able to I don't know how you handled when Paige said that she wanted to be a surrogate
Yeah.
for Uncle Robert.
Yeah.
Do you feel
So I can tell you that. I'm sure I'm happy to tell you that story. Again, it's all in my book, Stop the Tall Man, Save the Tiger. So, Uncle Robert, remember, cult leaders like to blur the lines of the nuclear family. So, in our little cult, we had my in laws, and then Paige and I and our kids. So, you got grandparents, parents, and kids, or grandchildren. And Robert had two sons, but they never showed up to our conferences ever. I met both of them once. And those sons got married, had daughters, but they didn't have grandsons or didn't have sons. So Robert didn't have a grandson. So many years into our marriage, in our little cult, you've got Paige's parents now are calling him Dad. We're calling him Uncle Robert. My kids are calling him Grandpa Bob or Uncle Robert. But Robert did not have grandsons. So then Paige was so alarmed and concerned for Robert's precious bloodline that he had to have an heir, a grandson, to continue his sublime brilliance. Otherwise, the world is doomed. And maybe that's a bit of hyperbole, but not much. So she wanted to be a surrogate and have, through in vitro fertilization, a child with Robert's oldest son, who I met once. And we never even met his wife. We didn't even know how she would think about this.
Mm.
So I remember asking Paige, I said, well, what would you do if you had a daughter? Would you try again? She said, yes. What happens if you had another daughter? She's like, I would keep trying until I had a son. Because she was just so sure that the Lord would bless this, that she would have a son, and that Robert's precious bloodline would be preserved. Now, on the one hand, okay, she has an adoration for this guy. But on the other hand, that was inappropriate on a million levels, right?
A million levels, absolutely.
And it
I
didn't
remember.
it did not happen.
Yes, that was going to be my next question. That never did happen. And I remember getting to that chapter in the book, and I went, "What?
Yeah.
Are you kidding me? How in the world was he able to handle this?" It just seemed to be getting crazier. And you can't make this stuff up. That some of the stuff that you wrote in your book.
I remember one of my attorneys telling me, Peter, you should just turn it into a novel. And I told him no one would believe it.
Yeah. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, is it not?
It is.
Tell us there were some strange disciplinary actions that Uncle Robert did with the kids. And I believe it was one of your sons that he did something harshly with, and can you tell the listeners about that you just did not like the way that he disciplined or corrected one of your kids?
Yeah. So there's a lot that I left out of the book, Chan, as I'm sure you can imagine. Now, was there anything really illegal that Robert did? No. Inappropriate? A lot. Yeah. So much of that I left out of the book. There was one little scene with one of my sons when he was like 2, I think. And, Uncle Robert just kind of barked at him in a very angry tone because my little 2-year-old, had the temerity to talk back to this elder, right? You were just, no matter if you were 2 or 20 or 200, you were not allowed to talk back to the cult leader. And I was very concerned with the way he handled it. Paige at the time was livid with me because she thought I ruined a golden opportunity for my son. Again, it was like 2 maybe, to learn the true lessons of life that only Uncle Robert could impart. Here I am just trying to, diffuse a situation because he was sitting on Uncle Robert's lap, and it was, these two were like jawing at each other. And I was alarmed by this. And I did include that story in the book. There are many others that were wildly more inappropriate. And I'm not going to go there, but
Gotcha.
Really bad. Okay. So, but what that showed was a continuation of his theology, which was that, you had to, in a sense, earn your salvation. You had to earn the right to even be considered a Christian, so then you can go through the gate, right? So you have to earn it. It's like kind of works. But it's not so much works, it's more of a perfection. Like once you are supposedly saved, then you're perfect and you'll probably never sin again. So therefore, the correction of our children, according to Robert's, theory and his teachings that, they went through Paige and went through me to the kids, was very harsh, over the top, and it wasn't loving. It just wasn't kind. Like on the one hand, yes, you spoil the rod, you spare the rod, spoil the child, but you're also not to exasperate the children. And, we are there to guide and love the children. The true heart change is going to come by the Lord. We make sure we kind of till the soil, right? Like we get it already, but the Lord waters it, the Lord plants the seed. It's kind of out of our hands. And Robert was far too heavy-handed. And again, he's so consistent in all these themes because he was very heavy-handed with me. I tried to be saved, I think, 5 times by the guy. And every time I would do it, I'd be like, oh, wow, I finally did it right this time. Nope, no, you didn't. And I was, incapable of receiving salvation, et cetera, et cetera. Robert claimed that he sinned once in his life. So again, think about his theology that, once you're saved, well, now you are perfect. Because what he would say was, Paul writing in Romans, there's 6, 7, and 8. Remember those chapters?
Yeah.
Really key. He thinks they should be in like reverse order. He thinks like the Bible got it wrong. To him, 7 and 8 should come first, then 6, because Paul talks about doing the things he doesn't want to do.
Absolutely.
And not doing the things he knows he should do. Okay. So Robert's like, well, no, once you're saved, that wouldn't happen. So they must have got it out of order. I mean, could you imagine the arrogance of saying that? But then he also claims that he sinned once as a boy. He disobeyed his father. And it's in the book. The story's in the book. And it's this cute little story, but it's for our little cult, it was like Pearl Harbor. It was 9/11. It was, the story of Uncle Robert and the sling and the little lamb. And he literally thought he'd sinned once in his life.
One time.
Yeah.
Man, even that would be enough to condemn all of us, to separation from God. Do you, at what point did you start? Because I remember there was one part in the book where over time you began to seek Uncle Robert's counsel, that you started to believe it for a while. And it seems like Paige almost every time, from even whether he should get a haircut or get his tooth pulled, then she was always contacting Uncle Robert.
Yeah.
And you got to that point for a while. Is that correct?
I did. So I believe that, my former wife, who's a victim just like I am, has been brainwashed and controlled by this man for pretty much her whole life. My former in-laws for the better part of the last 50 years. But I was really only brainwashed for about 2.5, 3 years tops. For most of the first, let's say 17 years of our marriage, I was very critical, very dubious of the man. And then it kind of got worse and worse until eventually, I softened and okay. And then when I was supposedly saved by him at that conference in 2015, I was kind of all in, again, for about 2.5 years. To when Paige finally left me and my family was imploding, he was the only one I talked to. I thought he was the answer to all my problems. And he was, because he was the problem, but I didn't realize
the problem.
it. Yeah, I didn't realize it.
He definitely was. Did you have an aha moment when you were like, okay, I got it now, I can see clearly? Or was it a step-by-step movement toward the truth?
I would say there were several of them. So Paige left me in 2017. Again, I'm completely brainwashed, devastated, never wanted the divorce, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. I was a wreck. Never suicidal, but it was just an absolute wreck. Didn't tell my family for 4 months. Didn't tell anybody in Montana for about 9 months. So nobody knew what was going on. But I would start sharing some of the emails I would get from Paige or Uncle Robert. And I was used to their very blunt, in your face, just incredibly inappropriate emails. I was used to that style. I started sharing them with my friends and family when I finally reached out for help and told them what was going on. And they were alarmed immediately. And of course, now I look back at these emails and my jaw hits the floor because they're so inappropriate. They're so wicked. They're so over the top. And yet I, didn't really blink at the time. But I started to be able to look at a few of those differently. And there was one email in particular, I thought, wait a minute, that's not true. And then there was another email, wait a minute, that's just not right. That doesn't make sense. So there was a few of those aha moments where Paige or Robert did something where I finally was becoming more healthy. And clearly this was the Lord where he opened my eyes and ears to the truth. And it took about a year, Chan. I mean, again, I was only brainwashed for, again, to about 2.5 years. It took me a year to really recover and get back on solid footing.
And you had some good people around you that loved you enough to tell you the truth. And at first you thought they were just being a little bit overcritical of Uncle Robert, correct?
So I knew that my family, kind of knew of Uncle Robert's. My family, my parents, my brothers, their wives, and all that. So the Young family, but they were all on the coast, so they didn't live with us. So they had no idea about Jewish conspiracies. They had no idea about casinos or called the office or their churches. They didn't know about any of this. And I slowly but surely shared it with them. But when I first reached out and I told them, my wife left me, I said, please do me two things. Just support me, but don't say anything negative about Paige and Uncle Robert. I just wasn't ready because I knew how they thought. A couple months in, one brother just could not hold it in any longer. And I don't know how he lasted even that long. And he finally said, yeah, I cannot believe he read another one of her emails. I cannot believe what Paige is doing. This is egregious and over the top. And I was stunned, Chan. I mean, I just wasn't used to anybody doubting Uncle Robert and Paige. Like, how could you do that? And he said, what do you mean, how could I do that? She's wrong. This is crazy. And I eventually saw it, but they were very patient with me, and which must have been very hard.
And tell our listeners what it is that you, I guess one of the heartbreaking parts of your book was how she used the kids as a weapon against you. Your two oldest boys moved out and basically told you that they didn't want to have anything to do with you anymore.
Yeah. So we had 5 kids, and when she first left, it was civil for about a month. But again, remember, the cult leaders blur the lines of the nuclear family, if not just outright destroy them. So that, I'm convinced now, looking back, was the plan for me. Was that spring after Paige had left, she and Uncle Robert started, kind of saying to me in person or in emails, you're not really a true father. You're so far from it. Just be a friend to the kids. Just be a friend to them. With the idea being that then their true father would be Uncle Robert. He would step in, because remember, my in-laws are calling him Dad at this point. And so then, since I'm the devil, I'm not saved, I'm not a Christian, Uncle Robert will step in and he'll be the true father, just like he was the true father for my in-laws and for Paige. Now he'd be the true father for my kids. And it's around that time I realized, wait a minute, there's something wrong with that. So in conjunction with that, Paige started telling the kids that I was the devil, was Satan, a sorcerer, a lion, a liar, abuser, you name it. And I should point out too that there was never any physical abuse, never any sexual abuse. There was never any infidelity. I absolutely loved and adored this woman. And so, what Paige was doing then was clearly unbiblical, right? Clearly unbiblical. So I think there was some difficulty for Robert because he knew his Bible. Like, wait a minute. He was always going to support Paige no matter what she did. Well, here she's doing something clearly unbiblical by leaving me. So they had to come up with plan B. And plan B was, Peter was never a Christian. He lied from the beginning. He was never saved. I knew it, and I should have listened to my gut. I should have never married him. He was never saved, so we were never truly married in the sight of God, which is nonsense. But that's what they came up with.
Yeah, that was crazy. But your older kids did y'all reconciled, correct?
I will say this: being a father or a mother, it's a marathon, not a sprint. My 2 oldest sons, again, all 5 of our children are victims, just like I was. They are on varying degrees of, let's say, recovery and reconciliation with me. In regards to the 2 oldest, there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, it's so y'all are still. How old are your oldest 2, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, the spread of my kids is 25 down to 12.
25 down to 12. Okay.
Yeah,
and
it's 5 children.
And your 2 oldest sons are the ones that had just left, said they weren't going to come visit or whatever. And y'all are, you had sole custody of them for a while, correct? Or was it joint custody?
No, so the 2 oldest, by the time that started to work through the courts, were of age, so they were not involved with it at all. What happened was, there were several people in my life that clearly saw the emotional, mental, and spiritual abuse of the children by Paige and Robert, because cults are emotionally abusive to children. Mm-hmm. That's not my opinion. It's, kind of an accepted fact. So we got what's called a guardian ad litem involved. And, so about 9 months after Paige left, she filed for divorce, and I was devastated. I just thought for somehow we're going to reconcile. We'll make it work. It'll be a miracle. What a great story. What a great testimony. We'll figure it out. And then she filed for divorce. I was devastated, which, I mean, it should have been obvious. The woman despised me. And then I said, no, I don't want the divorce. And so other people really urged us to get a guardian ad litem involved. They look after the best interests of the children in a high conflict divorce. Our first guardian ad litem wrote a bombshell report, 50 pages. Court saw it and sent the 3 youngest back to me. And they've been with me ever since. Which, on one hand is sad, but on the other hand, it was necessary because cults are abusive.
Yeah.
What the kids were being subjected to was horrible.
And thank goodness you had all those emails, because that was a big part of the evidence that you could present to the court.
It sheds light on the psyche of a devoted follower and a cult leader, in that Paige and Uncle Robert put so much of this in writing, in letters and emails. So I'm sure there's, again, listen, divorce happens. It's awful. It really, truly is awful. And there's probably a lot of he said, she said, right? And so who's right? Well, ours was all in writing, because remember, Uncle Robert is the only one who knows the true gospel. He's one of a handful in the world. So we don't care what a judge or a guardian ad litem thinks. We know the truth. You all are swine. We're not going to throw our pearls in front of you. And so then here's, the guardian ad litem with the judge reading all these letters and emails, and it's just in your face.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't hardly have to say anything.
Yeah. Yeah, that was fascinating. What if you were to help a listener who's hearing your story and they have a loved one that is in a cult? Because I know you go around and you're invited to do talks at churches and on podcasts about how do you help somebody when you know that they're in a cult, but they don't know they're in a cult. What advice would you give to someone who may have a loved one or a friend or family member that may be caught up in that?
Sure. Well, certainly the best bit of advice is try and get to them before it happens, because going in and out of a cult is unbelievably difficult and horrible, and you don't want to go through it. And I always say that you never know you are in a cult, you only know you were in one. I say that because, again, cults at their core are undue mind control. So no one joins a cult. They always think they're joining something else. They've got a special pastor, a special leader, business development, self-actualization, whatever you want to call it. It's never a cult, right? So they don't know it when they go in. And then when they are in, their mind is controlled. So you can never tell them you are a cult and they're going to believe it. If they believe it, if you get to somebody, Chan, like a friend or relative, and you've been able to separate them from the other cult leaders and members, and you explain to them, this is a cult, and they say, oh my gosh, you're right. That moment is when you have started to break the power of the mind control, because someone who's fully got their mind controlled would never admit that. So assigned to someone going into the cult, again, they don't know it, you do. So number one would be that they break off all kind of contact and communication. No more calls, no more emails. They don't show up to church, to Bible study, to bowling, to book club, whatever it is, right? And then they've got this new person in their life. It's a business club, it's a yoga club, nothing against yoga, but it could lead to stuff, or it's a new guru, whatever it is, a new pastor, and you can't question this person, right? Those are all red flags.
Mm-hmm.
Don't necessarily mean you're in a cult, but if you combine those, and then the person is completely now isolated, and their only real interaction is within this little cult, which again, they don't call a cult, but they don't really have close relations with anybody else. Those are huge red flags. And so then the way to combat that would be, first and foremost, you've got to maintain fellowship. We would go to church after church after church during our marriage. And eventually, the pastor would say something, and Paige was always on her cell phone with Robert, and we would leave. And we would stay at a church for, on average, probably 2 years. And so we just left church after church till we finally just stopped going, and we would just call him on the phone and do home church. So you've got to maintain strong fellowship. And again, first and foremost, Christian fellowship, right? But even if not, just with other people. If I cut off my finger, if you listen on the podcast, you can't see it, but if I cut off my finger, I'm not going to die. My finger will die. But the body of Christ is what gives it life, right? So when you become unattached to the body of Christ, the body of believers, that's when you become vulnerable to false teachers.
That's a great point. That's absolutely a great point. There's no such thing as a Lone Ranger Christian. and God never intended that to be the case. We all need each other. I remember when I was studying cults, I learned that the the teacher that I was listening to on this, he had a very unique way of describing it. He said that cults do math, and he said they add to the Word of God, they subtract from the Trinity, they multiply the ways to salvation, and they divide their followers' loyalties. When I was listening to you and reading your book, I could see almost all of those characteristics of a cult coming out in your book, especially the division of their followers' loyalties. I
Mhm.
mean, if Paige couldn't see that the wedge that was between y'all two was Uncle Robert, I mean, divide and conquer. And it's like you said with
Yeah.
the destruction of the nuclear family that's so sneaky. That's what's so crazy is how sneaky that was.
Yeah. So, there's the fruit of the Spirit: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control in Galatians chapter 3, I think. Before that, a few verses before that, it talks about the signs of the flesh, right? The fruit of the
Right.
flesh, or the signs of the flesh. And among them are divisions and factions and anger and hatred. And those are all things that Uncle Robert taught and espoused. And he might, of course, he again thinks I'm the devil. He might say, no, 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 I didn't. But well, actions speak louder than words. But Paige's family, she was one of five. She's got aunts and uncles and brothers and a sister. She hasn't seen them in 20 years because they all got shunned, all shunted and kicked to the curb because you were either with Uncle Robert or against him. So when my family kind of imploded, I remember I hadn't seen my youngest three kids in a long time, and I had reconnected with one of Paige's, well, her only sister, who had been quite vilified viciously.
And
And I,
she was the one that was kicked to the curb early on because she made an accusation against Uncle Robert for
yep,
sexual inappropriateness, and everybody believed Uncle Robert
yep,
except for some of her brothers or
two
their.
brothers. Yep. So the family got divided. That was in 2000. The two brothers and this one sister were kind of kicked to the curb. And let me fast forward, and I'll go back to it. But she had and I had reconnected. I hadn't talked to her in 17, 18 years. And I was visiting with my kids, and I had a picture of her kids on the cell phone. And I showed one of my daughters, do you know who this is? It's a little, 10-year-old girl. She said, no. I said, that's your cousin. She didn't even know. My daughter didn't even know she had these cousins because we never talked about it. We weren't supposed to. We weren't allowed to. We
Hmm.
weren't allowed to bring up that woman's family because she had the temerity, the gall to question Uncle Robert, 17, 18 years prior. And in that moment, this is go back to 2000, shows you how bad it is. This is kind of like it's similar to Paige wanting to be a surrogate. So we had one child and we had another on the way. And this is right about the time where the sister, and I know her real name and I changed it in the book. I can't remember what Rebecca, I changed it to Rebecca in the book. So she basically just said to Paige, listen, I don't think Uncle Robert is who he says he is. I don't think this guy's good for our family. I'm going to have nothing to do with him. And I would encourage you to do the same. Something along those lines. I wasn't there for that. And then Paige initially believed her very briefly and then, did a 180 and did not believe her. And right about that time, she went into the hospital on bed rest, and we nearly lost our second child. She was on bed rest, leaking amniotic fluid, and was there for 6 weeks. And then our son was in the ICU for another 6 weeks and barely survived, nearly died multiple times. And of course, the doctors didn't know, other than, well, she's leaking amniotic fluid, but we don't know why. But Paige did. She was convinced that the Lord was judging her
Hmm.
because she had not come to Robert's aid quickly, that she had slandered Robert's name. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, like, again, do the math, right? You literally think that the Lord nearly killed our unborn son. Remember, it talks about in the Bible that he knits us in the mother's womb. He nearly killed our innocent unborn son because Paige didn't protect the good name of Robert Booty? Really? But that shows the mind control.
Yeah, it absolutely does. Well, Peter, we just got a few minutes here. If people want to get your book, show your book again.
Yep.
Stop the Tall Man,
Save the tiger. There you
Save the
go.
Tiger. And how would they, if they wanted to get a copy of your book, how would they be able to do that?
Sure. The easiest way is just to go to Amazon. I have two books, Stop the Torment, Save the Target, and also The Blue Team. They're both available on Amazon. You could also go to my website. It'll direct you to Amazon. But I've got lots of videos and stories on my website. It's authorpeteryoung.com. I love doing book reviews. I've got a YouTube channel and all that, and I've got other stories. I kind of consider myself a storyteller who's trying to become a better writer. As a broadcaster for many years, that's what I did. And this is one thing that drove Robert Booty nuts, because he didn't know sports. He wouldn't know a basketball from a football. And I love sports, right? Like that's what I did in The Blue Team. It's about faith in basketball, and I love using sports as a metaphor for life. And so we're storytellers. That's how we convey truth and ideas and important messages. In the Bible, Christ did it. We call them parables.
Mm-hmm.
But we share important moments and life experiences and truth through stories. That's what I love to do.
Absolutely. And when I read the part in your book that you had two dogs, and one of them's name was Larry and the other one was Magic, I about fell out. I'm like, true basketball guy right there.
Yep.
As a matter of fact, we've got our kids, their first Christmas puppy. We wanted to give him a basketball name, and my wife, I wish I would have thought of this first, but she did. We called him Hooper, and that was in 2008, and he's still alive today.
Wow.
He's kicking. He's a miracle dog, but that's Hooper. But yeah, Magic and Larry were your two dogs. That is just unbelievable.
And Larry was a golden retriever, and Magic was a chocolate lab.
That's
made it even better.
Awesome. Those two guys. I still will watch Larry Bird stories on YouTube. Just anybody that grew up in that era like we did, watching him is just incredible.
Okay, here's a basketball story that I don't think you know about. I haven't told you this. So I played at George Washington University, and way back when, like in the 40s, Red Auerbach played at George Washington University. So Red Auerbach, of course, the great Hall of Fame coach and general manager for the Boston Celtics, the guy that won, I think, 8 titles as a coach, or 9, and drafted Larry Bird, right? So he always had a house in Boston, obviously, but also down in D.C. all those years. So George Washington University is in D.C. So one day I'm getting ready to go to practice, and Red and my coach at the time had just got done playing a game of racquetball. Red loved to play racquetball. And I'm walking towards the locker room, my jaw drops. It's Red Auerbach, right? And I'm a freshman. I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Red Auerbach. Because again, one day I'm going to be, next to Larry Bird. And my coach goes, Red, this is Peter Young. Peter, this is Red. Red, this is Peter Young, one of our freshmen. And Red doesn't say hi, how are you? Nice to meet you. He's got that gravelly voice and an unlit cigar. He says, Young, you can shoot, but you can't do nothing else. And I never said another word to him. That's the only time he ever talked to me.
That is great.
So at least he thought I could shoot.
That is great. One last question here. Is Paige still with, under the control of Uncle Robert?
Yeah, unfortunately, for years, Chan and I prayed. I'm remiss. I don't do it every day, but I used to pray every day that she would have a road to Damascus type moment and see the truth. And I realized that, the Lord doesn't need my help. He can do it on his own. He can save her. And she is responsible for everything that she's said and done. But she is a victim. And unfortunately, there's been no change in the last, 6-7 years. It's not good. And it's sad.
That's sad. You don't see her much anymore? Do you?
I don't ever see her. No, I mean, we still have children obviously together that we have to kind of coordinate with, but it's not good. Yeah.
Well, surely she knows about your books, huh?
She does, and there have been several people that were warning me about getting sued for libel and all that. And I'm not worried at all. I've got pages and pages in the book of direct quotes of letters and emails.
Yeah.
That they wrote, that they said about me. And I was hoping that one day she would read the book and that the light would come on.
Yeah.
Who knows? I don't know. It's in the Lord's hands.
It is in the Lord's hands. And I hope that she eventually does have that road to Damascus, you know, uh, experience like you mentioned, and I know that would be a joyful day for you. And so one more time, the book is Stop the Tall Man, Save
Yep.
the Tiger, and I love
Absolutely.
the cover. I love the
Yeah.
cover. You can get that at Amazon, and then authorpeteryoung.com is Peter's website. And Peter, I could probably just sit and talk with you for hours on this kind of
We
on
could
this
swap
kind of
stories
stuff.
for a long time. I'll tell you what, Chandler, if you're willing, let's do this again because I am currently in the midst of writing the sequel to The Blue Team, and that will come out in 2024.
Okay. Okay,
So
we'll definitely have to do that. We'll stay in touch. I can't believe I've and you're living in Idaho right now?
Montana.
In Montana. Okay, because you've been
Southern
around a
Montana.
few places up there, especially
Yeah.
in your book. Well, any last words for our listeners here
You know,
before we?
I would say, first of all, Chan, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. It's fun to talk. And it's as long as we've talked, we still probably haven't scratched the surface of all the basketball that we'd want to talk about. But in terms of like parting, thoughts, right? Because if you've listened to this whole time, you're really only going to remember one or two things. Remember this: that if you do have a loved one that you suspect or think might be under the sway, under the undue mind control of somebody who's inappropriate, cult leader or not, guru, whatever you want to call it, chances are they're not going to reach out to you. You have to make the first step. You have to be willing to engage in what will probably be a very difficult and uncomfortable conversation. But that's love. You've got to do it. Don't be shy.
Absolutely.
Don't wait for them.
All right, Peter, I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for your time and listeners. I hope you enjoyed this time and learned something about Peter and learned something about cults and what exactly it is and how the mind control can actually take you further than you ever thought you would be able to go. So, well, thanks, Peter. You and I will
Yeah.
stay in touch, and I will be posting this pretty soon. So, Lord bless you,
You
and
too.
I can't wait to talk to you again.
All right. Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
All right, you bet.
Bye bye.